Ephesians chapter 4 is the place we'll start. Ephesians chapter 4. Several years ago, C.S. Lewis wrote a book called The Screwtape Letters. It's a work of satire, and that kind of means everything's backwards. And the whole idea behind that book is there's a chief demon called Screwtape who has a lesser demon called Wormwood. And the whole thing is Screwtape, chief demon, trying to convince Wormwood how to really exercise his authority and control over this new Christian. And he's doing everything within his power to get that guy off track and make sure he doesn't become a devoted follower of Jesus. And at one point in the book, there's this passage where Chief Demon Screwtape is talking to Wormwood, the lesser demon, and they have this exchange. And Screwtape says, the enemy, now it's satire, so everything's backwards, and so the enemy is actually God. But this is backwards. The enemy's servants have been preaching about the world as one of the great temptations for 2,000 years. But then he says, but fortunately, they've said very little about it for the last few decades. And so in this writing, he's saying it's good, that they've stopped talking about the world so much and they've stopped talking about sin so much because now they've left it alone for so long that any mention of the world or any mention of the vanities of the world or any mention of sin or temptation kind of sounds strange today. It sounds like Puritanism, he goes on to say. And nobody wants to sit around and hear any of that. And Screwtape tells Wormwood that by avoiding talk about sin and the world and things like that, we have captured so many of this present generation and they'll never go back to God. What a great victory they have by not talking about the world anymore. What's interesting to me is that line in the Screwtape letters was written 82 years ago in 1942. And I think it's interesting that in 1942, when many times we look back and talk about the glory days or whatever, they're talking about already, people aren't talking about the world, they're not talking about sin, they're not talking about temptation a whole lot, and what a great victory that is for the adversary, the enemy, and everything that he wants to do in the world. It takes us, unfortunately, away from God. That was in 1942, and here we are, 82 years later, and we still don't talk about sin a whole lot. Well, today, I guess that changes for us. I've not really talked about it a whole lot, and I don't really know what the reason for that is. But we're going to start today talking about sin. Aren't you glad you came to church today? We're going to talk about sin a little bit, but maybe not the way that you think we are going to talk about sin. For a lot of times, we talk about sin as, this is eternal condemnation, and this is, you do this, and it violates, or it wrecks your relationship with God, and we'll talk some about that. But mainly, I want to kind of view sin in this series as something like a poison. And if you think about it, it really does fit. Because a poison is something that is, yes, dangerous, and it can be deadly. I mean, if you take too much of it, it can be very dangerous, even to the point of death. You may not realize that what this poison is actually poison whenever you encounter it, and so it can be a little bit deceptive. It's a lot like sin. It can be something that is addictive. A lot of times we talk about things that are a little bit toxic, a little bit poisonous to us, can become addictive to us. The Surgeon General's warning is not there for nothing. It is dangerous, it's destructive, it can become an addictive thing in our lives. And sometimes, whenever we're encountering just a little bit of it, we become immune to it. We have a little bit of it, we know that it may be present in our lives, but we allow that thing to hang around for a little while, or allow that thought to have a little bit of place in our mind, and before you know it, it doesn't bother us anymore. We become immune to it, we don't recognize the danger, the destruction that it can bring into our lives, but that's what a poison does, and that's how we're going to label sin today. Now, we don't talk a whole lot about sin. We kind of divide into a couple of groups when it comes to talking about sin. One group says it doesn't really matter anymore. Just do what you want to do, live how you want to live. No restraint, no bounds or anything like that. The other group says, I know that sin really does matter, but it's there, and I just can't kick the habit. And so sometimes we think about sin as something we don't need to talk about because it doesn't really matter. Sometimes we think about it as what use is it in talking about it because it's ingrained in us and we're not going to stop and we're just terrible creatures or whatever. But the reality is, in the end, we've got to talk about some of these things. And we got to talk about them because for 1,500 years of Christianity, sin really mattered. For 1,500 years, people talked about the things that we're going to talk about for the next few weeks. They recognized that sin was destructive in life. They recognized that sin was not in line with God's good intentions of the world. In other words, God created a beautiful place, a great place, a good place where people are supposed to exist in harmony with one another and get along and support and encourage and cherish one another. But sin gets us away from God's good intentions for the world. And the way that it does that is it turns what is beautiful in creation ugly, and it turns what is upbuilding in creation as derogatory, and it just really messes all kinds of things up. For 1,500 years, people talked about that stuff. They talked about it because they recognize it's not just harmful to us like poison is. When that poison gets in us and it starts to bear fruit in our lives, it becomes very harmful to people around us. And it destroys what God wants to do in the world. They talked about it because it's enslaving, and they recognized it. Now, they didn't really probably understand the way the brain works and the dopamine and all that, but they recognize that sometimes we get involved in these things that are dangerous and destructive and poisonous, and we get attached to them, and we become enslaved to these things, and it becomes a very difficult cycle to break. What I want you to know on the front end is that this is not just an arbitrary list of sins or vices or problems that get us down. These are listed out in Scripture for good reason. I want to share with you 3 passages this morning as we kind of start this. These are all from the pen of Paul. And as he talks about these things, he shows us that there's value in naming these vices. There's value in recognizing them in our lives so that we know what we need to turn away from. We'll come back to that point in just a few minutes. But let's start very simply in Ephesians 4, verse 22. Paul's in the middle of a big discussion about new life. And he says in verse 22, to put off your old self. Well, that sounds great. It's a little bit vague because I can make old self mean anything in the world that I want it to mean. Put off your old self. Great. Let's just consider that one done. Put off your old self, which belongs to your former manner of life and is corrupt through deceitful desires. Going to come right back to that one. And be renewed in the spirit of your minds, and to put on the new self, created after the likeness of God in true righteousness and holiness. Now, Paul says a lot in those 3 verses. And what he says in those 3 verses, number 1, is that whatever we're talking about is something about our desires. Now, is desire a bad thing? No, can't be. God put humans in this world, on this creation, and said, go desire one another. That's a good thing. Go be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it. That doesn't happen without desire. God places within us, I think, desires for one another, desires for God, desires for things that can be good in our lives. We have the innate desire to eat. That's a good thing. We have this innate desire to seek out love. That's a good thing. Desires aren't bad. Desires are good until they become corrupted. That's what Paul says. Put off the old self that belongs to the former manner of life, verse 22, because it is corrupt through deceitful desires. You and I think we got this in common. We're pretty good at doing what we want to do. Would you agree with that? We are pretty good at doing what we desire to do. If I want to do it, pretty good chance I'm going to go do it. Maybe you're the same way. So desires can be good. If I do what I'm typically desiring to do or want to do, it's a good thing until that desire becomes a bit disordered. It's Augustine's thoughts. It becomes deceitful, and I think it may be a good thing, but really it's not, and I don't even recognize it. I kind of got a blind spot there in my life because it has become corrupted. Paul says the whole idea in verse 23 and verse 24 is to be renewed in our minds and put on something different, put on something new, to be something new in the image of, after the likeness of God in true righteousness and holiness. You and I, we also got this in common. We were created in order to bear the image of God, to seek out life as God would seek it out, to live it like God would live our lives. That's the image and the likeness of God. And Paul says, if we're going to do that, we got to understand what our desires are, even though they may be shielded from us and there are blind spots in our lives. Figure out what that desire is. Is it deceitful or is it good? Do I need to put it off or do I need to encourage it? That's the idea. Which one bears better fruit? Which one leads me more closely into the image of Jesus? That's the idea in Ephesians 4, verses 22 through 24. Put off the old so that you can become what you're supposed to be, the new man, the new person, more in the image of Jesus. Not a whole lot of descriptive words, though, in Ephesians chapter 4, and that's okay, because in Colossians, Paul becomes much more specific. All right, Colossians chapter 3, we're going to start at verse 5. Same language, right? Same idea. We're putting off something so we can put on something. We're doing away with some stuff in life. Need to do away with some stuff in life because it's poisonous. We may not recognize that it's destructive and it's dangerous and it's deadly and it's enslaving and we're becoming immune to it. We don't even see it because it's deceitful. But we got to figure it out and put it off. And Paul gives us some ideas about what it may look like. Verse 5, put to death, therefore, what is earthly in you. Well, okay, he's not going to be vague this time. Sexual immorality or impurity or passions or evil desires, not just desires, evil desires, covetousness, which is idolatry. On account of these, the wrath of God is coming. In these, you too once walked when you were living in them. But now you must put them all away. Here's another list. Anger, wrath, malice, slander, obscene talk from your mouth. I thought I was just talking. I didn't mean anything by it. Well, Paul says maybe you did. Do not lie to one another, seeing that you've put off the old self with its practices and have put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge after the image of its creator. Same language, right? Paul is saying you got to put off some things that make you look less like God, less like Jesus, so that you can in turn put on some things that make you more like God and more like Jesus. We're going to keep coming back to that same idea. You may not even know. This is what's deceitful about it. We may not even know that poison that has crept into our lives is drawing us away from the image of Jesus. You may not even know it. It's a blind spot. It's a dark area. We don't think about it. We don't talk about it. But maybe it is, and we're immune to it. Here, there's no Greek, no Jew, circumcised, uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave, free, but Christ is all and in all. Now put on then. Here's the positive side of it. Verse 12. Put on, as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, and kindness, and humility, and meekness, and patience, and bear with one another. And if one has a complaint against one another, forgive each other, as the Lord has forgiven you, so you also must forgive. And in verse 14, and above all these, put on love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. Paul says you got to put off some of the old so that you can put on the new. You got to put off, of, cut off whatever is holding you back from being more conformed into the image of Jesus so that you can put on those lists that bring you closer to Christ and closer into his image. Romans 12, 1 and 2 is the more famous one. Not to be conformed to the image of the world, not to be conformed to the world, but to be transformed by the renewing of our minds. They're all about starting with what we think. What we think about God matters. What we think about our behaviors matters. What we think about sin matters. It's not just an arbitrary or abstract list of rules or set of things to avoid. These are things that we are to avoid for good reason, because they're destructive and they're deadly and they're ugly and they're not in line with God's good intentions for his creation. And we can be pretty specific about what those things are in our lives. And I would say we ought to be pretty specific about what the destructive, ugly, harmful, dangerous behaviors in our lives are. Because if they haven't got you yet, they will. If you're not enslaved to those things yet and you continue down that line, you will be. There's really no way around that. If you continue in those things, you will eventually become addicted and enslaved to those things. And so for good reason, for 1,500 years, people took sin seriously. And if you give me 2 or 3 minutes, here's what it looked like. Early on in the days of Christianity was opposed by the major global governments. And so especially within the Roman Empire, you read a lot about the suffering persecution of Christians at the hands of the Romans in the book of Acts and in the early New Testament letters, and even in the book of Revelation. It's veiled, but it's there. And so you see a lot of Christianity pushing up against the empire of Rome. And it a lot of times turns out pretty badly for the Christians. And that kind of thing continued for a couple of hundred years. But then it became legal within the Roman Empire to be a Christian. It was legalized. And you would think, good. It's legal to be a Christian. Nobody's going to come persecute me or burn me at the stake or whatever because I'm a professing Christian anymore. Great. I got peace. I can have a little more prosperity. Things are going to get easier for me as a Christian. And we may look at that and say, good. We're thankful for our freedoms. But there was a group of folks who said, maybe Christianity is about to get too easy for us. It's never been that way. It wasn't easy for Jesus. It wasn't easy for the first followers of Jesus. Maybe it shouldn't be that simple and easy for us. So 10 years after Christianity was legalized in Rome, a group of folks went out into the deserts. And they intentionally fled a life of potential power and status, a life of wealth for a lot of them, and fame, and a lot of good things we may want. And they left all that to go out into the desert to face temptation head on. They saw that's what Jesus did, and they wanted to do it. They faced temptation head on in the desert. And they weren't just out there by themselves, not doing anything, not talking about anything, not thinking about anything. They were seeking formation to be formed into the kind of people who can put off the old that Paul wrote about so that they can put on the new. And so they spent their days and their nights thinking about, how do we move away from sin? How do we kill sin in our lives? How do we make it not desirable for us? How do we get away from our passions? How do we get away from falling into those traps that the devil lays for us all the time? And they believed that they had to be forming themselves into a better kind of person. They understood that they don't see as they ought to see, and they don't think as they ought to think, and they miss maybe what they ought to be doing with their lives. And so it was all about awareness, self-awareness, examining their motivations and their deepest and darkest desires. And so along the way, we're going to fast forward a little bit, they came up with a list of virtues, a good list, that they wanted to seek out in their lives. And on that good list of virtues they wanted to seek out in their lives were things like faith and hope and love. Those are great. Those are biblical. Paul writes a lot about faith and being a faithful, loyal kind of person, trustworthy kind of person. That's great. Seek that out. Hoping in something better than this life. These guys went out away from everything that most people hoped for and had to hope in something. They wanted to love one another. They wanted to love God. They sought godly wisdom. They wanted to seek justice and live with courage and temperance. And they understood that these are qualities, actually these are habits, character traits that every Christian should seek out. 7 of them. That's the good list. They also came up with a bad list, what I'll call a bad list. And on the bad list were 7 vices, not just sins, character traits, habits that they believed every Christian needs to learn to avoid and pinpoint and examine in their lives to see if these kinds of things exist. Lust. Gluttony. When's the last time you had a sermon on gluttony? I'm curious. Have you ever heard a sermon on gluttony? Well, we'll try to avoid potlucks and stuff, but we're going to do that one. They talked about greed, being envious of other folks. They talked about, vainglory is kind of the idea that I don't really want to be a good person. I just want you to think that I'm a good person. And so they sought ways to get away from those kinds of things, sloth and wrath. And, we're really going to step on some toes, I think, some of these weeks. But it's good, because my hope in this is not to make you feel bad about it. It's not to make you feel worthless or anything like that. It's to say, these are poison, all right? You may think a little bit of it, it's okay. But you get a little bit of it, and you want a little bit more of it, right? And you get a little bit more of it, and you start to see, maybe it is a little bit dangerous, but I think I can avoid it. I can avoid the pitfalls. I can just look a little bit, right? I can just, be greedy a little bit. I can just kind of be a little bit hypocritical at times. That's okay. But before you know it, that dangerous poison grows and you're immune to it and you don't even recognize that it's showing up more and more and more in your life. In Paul's language, everything on the screen right now is about our passions. It's about our desires. It's about being able to pinpoint where our desires are good and they lead to the good list of love and hope and faith and temperance, and where they're disordered or corrupted and they lead to something much worse. It's all about our desires and our passions. So for 1,500 years, Christianity was serious about it. Let's cultivate the virtues in our lives. Let's seek out and discern how we can be better at those virtues and create better habits in our lives, because we're creatures of habit, and we want those things to become second nature to us. And they were also adamant about looking at the bad list and saying, where's this creeping in? Where am I getting some of this? A little bit of lust, a little bit of greed, a little bit of gluttony, a little bit of envy. Got to cut those things out before they become so dangerous that they're deadly, and I'm ensnared and enslaved and trapped in this cycle. Would you turn in your Bibles to 2 Peter chapter 1 with me? For 1,500 years, people were serious about overcoming the sin problem. They were serious about creating a virtuous life away from the vices, more in line with the virtues. But around the year 1500 or so, the great Christian Reformation began. And people who were seeking to reform Christianity, a lot of noble causes, began to worry about what I think we would label today as works righteousness for the first time. And that's kind of lofty language, but what that basically means is we don't want to work our way into a relationship with God, because we believe that faith is a gift and grace is a gift, and there's nothing that we really need to do, strive for, to attain, lest we are working our way into a relationship with God. I mean, really, if justification is by grace and faith, there's nothing that I should be doing, then why worry about doing anything better? This harkens back to the cheap grace conversation we had last week. The problem, I think, is that we still have passages like 2 Peter 1, verse 3, his divine power has granted to us all things that pertain to life and godliness, through which the knowledge of him who called us into his own glory and excellence, by which he has granted to us his precious and very great promises, so that through them you may become partakers of the divine nature. That phrase is sometimes lost because we want to get into the list of virtues real quick. But let's camp out there for just a second, all right? So that we can become partakers of the divine nature. Or you may say, the image of God. Or in Paul's language, more conformed into the image of God. So that in Colossians 3 and in Ephesians 4, the passages that we read earlier, we're not conformed to the image of the world anymore with its vices. We are transformed from that, and we are more conformed into the image of Jesus with the virtues. And we seek those things out in our lives. That's what Peter's getting at right here, 2 Peter chapter 1. Partakers of the divine nature, so that we can become more like the image of God. So that we can live our lives more like Jesus would live our lives were he living them today. What does that look like, Peter? Great question. Verse 5, for this very reason, make every effort. There's a little work involved here. The vices are things that happen naturally. The vices are things that we just kind of fall into because maybe our desires lead us that way, and it's second nature to us, and it's easy to do that. We don't recognize how dangerous and deadly it may be and how enslaving it may become, and so we just kind of drift in that area. In order to pursue the virtues, it takes a little effort. And so he says, for this reason, make every effort to supplement your faith with virtue. Virtue, knowledge. Knowledge with self-control. Self-control with steadfastness. Steadfastness with godliness. Godliness with brotherly affection, brotherly affection with love. For if these qualities are yours and are increasing, there's a little effort involved here, they keep you from being ineffective or unfruitful in the knowledge of our Lord Jesus Christ. So Peter's pretty clear. There's something that we take effort to do to become more and more like Jesus. So in Paul's language, there should be a putting off of the old, the lust, the anger, the wrath, the malice. There should be a putting off of the old and a putting on of the good, the new, the love, the hope, the peace, the patience, the kindness, the goodness, the faithfulness, the gentleness, and the self-control. Put on the new in Christianity. We move away from sin and towards something much better than sin. That's how it should work anyway. The problem with that goes back to our desires. In James chapter 1, this is what Pete read for us at the beginning of this service. James chapter 1 is where he says, let no man say when he is tempted that I am tempted by God. Because God does not tempt anybody. That's not the work of God. He doesn't want anybody to fail. He's not trying to trip you up or cause you any problems. Let no one say when he's tempted, I am tempted by God. God cannot be tempted with evil, and he will not tempt anyone. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desires. Again, desire's not bad. We have desires within our humanity because God put it there. And God doesn't make mistakes, and God doesn't put things where they don't need to be, and so he placed within us humans a desire. The problem is our desires can become corrupted and disordered, and instead of seeking love, I may seek lust. Or instead of seeking kindness, I may seek greed. Or instead of faith, I may choose doubt, or something like that. Our desires can become corrupted, and we are drawn away and enticed by those desires. Then, desire, when it's conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it's fully grown, brings forth death. And the problem with that is if our desires are so strong, it's poison, remember? If our desires are so strong and so ingrained in our lives, then we can be pulled away and enticed and drawn away on that road and not even know it. It could be happening to you and me today, and I've never even considered it. Here's how it works. Here's the process. I think it's very helpful to know what the process is. It may be something different for all of us, different things for different people, but there's a process, and it usually begins by saying, you know what? I noticed something. It's there. And it may be something that's going to lead to lust or greed or envy or wrath or something like that, but I just notice that it's there. That's step one. And we can all be there. I notice it's there. Step two may be, you know what? I notice that it's there, and the more I think about it, the more I play it out in my mind, that's a little bit interesting. I may want to think a little bit more about that. It's there. The temptation is there. Could be interesting. And then maybe step three in the process is it's not just interesting. Now that I've thought about it a little bit, I may enjoy that. I may like it. It may be fun. It may bring me pleasure. I think I may like that. I may enjoy that. And so step number 4 may be something like, you know, I notice that it's there and it's kind of interesting. The more I think about it, I really may enjoy that. I think I'll welcome that into my life. Just kind of see how it goes. Not going to ask it in to stay, you know. We're not giving it a home or anything. We're just saying, let's bring it in. Let's see how it goes. Let's welcome it just for this one time. You know, not hurting anybody but myself. Let's just welcome it in one time and see how it goes. I give it a shot. And then I like it. And I come away with that one time. I didn't mean to like give it a home and make a place for it at my table and give it a bed to sleep in. I meant to just bring it in one time. But before you know it, that was fun. That felt good. Felt really good. I know it may have hurt somebody. It may have hurt me. But it's a little bit. And it felt good. And it was pleasurable. And I really enjoyed that. And so you know what? I have a memory now. And it was fun. It was pleasurable. I enjoyed it. Before you know it, I want to do it again. Because it's not just there and interesting and maybe fun. I know that it is. And before you know it, a habit is formed. And you have to have more of it to increase the same chemical in your brain. And so you keep going more and more and more. And before you know it, it's not just a habit that is formed. It's an addiction. And you can't quit looking at the screen. And you can't quit desiring more. And you can't quit flying off the handle and being mad at everybody all the time. You can't quit it because it's ingrained in your life. The process is there. It's become what we would call second nature to you. And back up at step 1, when you just noticed that it was there, you never thought it would get to that, right? You just noticed it. And it was interesting. And you thought, well, it could be fun just this one time. And before you know it, it has spiraled out of control. And it's become second nature to you. And it's exploited and nagged at what was already in your desire, in your imagination. You were weak on that one day, or you were confused about something that one day, and whatever it is that is at odds with God's intentions for your life found a way in, it got a foothold, and before you know it, your desires are corrupted. and you wind up substituting a cheap imitation for true fulfillment. Why are we so drawn to that bad list? Can we put that back up on the screen there, Michael, the bad list? Why, whenever we look at the bad list, are those things that you know exist in your life today? 2,000 years after they first started thinking about what the vices really may be that keep getting humans down, why does this list continue? Why does it hit so close to home with us? Could it be that they name the distortions that we know about ourselves? Could it be that when you look at that list on the screen, you may not have all 7 of them, and I hope you don't, but there's one. And you know that it's a struggle for you. It's familiar to you. You know it. Maybe nobody else does, but you know that it's there. You see it in the mirror every morning, and it hits close to home. And you may feel a little targeted right now. I don't mean that, but I want you to know it's poison. It's dangerous, it's destructive, and it could be a poison that's working on you right now without you even knowing about it. So what do you do? What do you do in response to this? Now, we're going to dive into these in some pretty specific ways over the next few weeks, and I hope you're along for the ride here. We're going to get pretty specific about some of these things, but what do you do today? Well, I think you examine yourself. I think that's the biblical call. Oft-repeated refrain. Examine yourself. Take a look at life. What needs to be put off so that what needs to show up in your life can be put on? What needs to die so that the good things can live? In what ways, maybe, am I in my life right now going down the road of poisonous vices? They don't have a grip on me just yet. I may be at the interesting stage, or I just notice it stage, or I may be at the stage where I think, I may enjoy that, but I hadn't really enjoyed it yet. What road are you going down? I want you to know it's dangerous. What path do you need to get off of so that you can get on a path that leads to a better, more virtuous life? What do you do? I think you ask this question. What would God want me to just get on with? I don't think it's news to anybody in this room today, or anybody that hears me, in the room or not, that God would want us to be more faithful people. I don't think it's a surprise to anybody that God would want us to be more hopeful people, to be more loving and kind and helpful and encouraging people. I don't think it's any secret that God wants us to be that kind of person. On the list of the put-ons, not the put-off, the put-ons, it's not news to anybody that that's the kind of people that we should be trying to be, striving to be, making an effort to be in our lives. That's Peter's language. And so I think a helpful question as we close today is, what do I need to put off? Like, what are the dangerous, poisonous paths that I'm on right now? And what would God just want me to get on with? In other words, what habits do I need to break? What addictions are present maybe in my life that I need to get out of, break the cycle? And what do I need to get on with? What do I need to start? What better habits, more virtuous habits, do I need to start instilling in my life today? I can't answer it for you, but I want you to answer it. What would God want you to just do today to overcome the vice and get more in line with virtue? With His help, with His Spirit, we can make this progress. It's poison. I want you to know it. I want you to recognize it. I want you to not just think we're talking about sin so we feel bad about ourselves. We're talking about this because it is dangerous. It's destructive. Families are broken. Marriages are broken because of poison, and they don't realize it oftentimes until it's broke. Realize it, know it, see it, label it, put it off so that you could put on something better. Maybe you're here today and ready to start this journey, and you know the poison's in your life. I know that it's there, but I hadn't done anything with it. Maybe that's your attitude right now. Maybe today you're ready to become a Christian. You're ready to begin this journey with Christ, where it's a better path, more Christ-like image, conformed into the image of the Son of God, to become the kind of person God created us to be and stop going around His good intentions. And so maybe today you're baptized into Christ. You come up out of the water, ready to live a new kind of life. And that's the new kind of life, where you call poison what it is, you call a sin, and you just get on with doing what God wants you to do. That's the newness of life. You're ready to start that journey today, great. Or maybe you're here, started that journey a long time ago, but you didn't recognize the poison for the poison that it is. You didn't see how dangerous and destructive and deceitful your desires could be, and your desires have been molded into this kind of thing where what's second nature to you is dangerous and deadly, and it's harmful to you and the people around you. And maybe today you're ready to get off of that track, get on a better path, not towards the vices, but towards virtue. And maybe you're ready to start that journey today privately. Maybe you want us to be praying for you as you begin that kind of journey. There's something else going on in your life that we can help you with today. But if there's poison, see it for what it is, name it for what it is, put it off so that you can become the kind of person God created us to be.